Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. And yeah, thank you, Rachel, for organizing this webinar and the whole Bring Back the Pollinators webinar series. As she mentioned, my name is Aaron. I'm a pesticide program specialist with the pesticide program here at the Xerces Society. And I'll be speaking to you today about one of the core parts of Bring Back the Pollinators, avoiding pesticides. So we'll talk about managing pests while protecting pollinators at home. So I wanted to give you a quick outline so you all know where we're headed with this talk. I'll give you some quick basics on pollinators and why they're important, and then dive into talking about pests, pesticides, and the risks they pose to pollinators. And then think about how we can prevent, monitor, and respond to pest issues in our home gardens and yards while keeping pollinators in mind. In particular, touching on conservation, biological control, and natural enemies, which I think are really exciting. So I wanted to first acknowledge and thank all of these Xerces Society supporters. Without them, we couldn't do the work that we do. So their support is so important. On that note, I also want to add that we're a donor-supported nonprofit. So if you aren't already a member and you're able, I really encourage you to donate and become a member today. So if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society, if this is your first webinar with us, we've been around since 1971, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. Our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. It lived in the coastal sand dunes around the San Francisco area. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work with programs focusing on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticides, and we're doing community engagement work as well in residential communities. We really work in all sorts of areas. Here are some photos kind of showing those different areas. But I think one of the most helpful things we do is writing detailed science-based guides for protecting pollinators and other invertebrates. And you can visit our website for free national and regional resources on plants, pollinators, and other invertebrates. This library is, it's really decades of work, and it has fantastic resources. So I really encourage you to check it out. So since this is a Bring Back the Pollinators presentation, I want to touch first on the importance of pollinators and why it's so important to conserve them. This section is going to be review for a lot of you, but I want to get us all on the same page. And for those interested in more information, there really is a wealth of info on pollinators, how to provide habitat for them, and things of that nature in the Xerces library that I mentioned. And again, this is part of the Bring Back the Pollinators webinar series. So I also encourage you to look at the other webinars in the series for more information. So pollinators are incredibly important for natural systems. They allow wild flowering plants to reproduce and continue reseeding in their environments. The seeds and fruits that these flowering plants produce are also food sources for many other types of wildlife, from birds to mammals. Through the simple act of moving pollen from flower to flower, pollinators really help build out the base of the food chain for a lot of species. They're also part of that that kind of base themselves, that food chain. About 9 in 10 bird species eat insects at some point in their lives. And caterpillars or larval butterflies and moths are really important food sources for many birds, especially when they're feeding their young. Some birds will also occasionally eat bees, either in their larval or adult forms. So insects are really a tremendous source of protein for birds. And pound for pound, they actually contain more than twice as much protein as beef, which I think is really, really incredible. Pollinators, of course, are also critical for our diet. We eat the seeds, the fruits, the nuts, and plants that result from pollination. So this photo is from a small project Xerces did with Whole Foods. And it shows what a typical produce section looks like at a grocery store with all of the foods we enjoy that are pollinated. And here on this next slide, we see the offerings that would be provided in a supermarket grocery section if there were no pollinators. And as you can see, that difference really is incredibly stark. Okay, so who's responsible for this really important service? There are a lot of different animals that visit flowers, usually for their sugary nectar, and end up pollinating those plants. I have some example images of them on this slides. We have butterflies and moths, beetles, hummingbirds, and even some flies, in particular circuit flies, like that one on the purple flower in the middle, the top middle. They all provide pollination. You probably realized I didn't mention bees. They get their own slide because they're so important. They're our most important pollinators. And we really have an amazing diversity of native bees in the US. There's more than 5,000 species in North America, more than 3,600 in the US alone. And they range in size from really big carpenter bees to tiny bees that are just about the size of a grain of rice. And many of them don't look like what you might picture when you think of a bee, like that metallic green sweat bee that's in the bottom center right photo. It's a really, really beautiful bee. I think they're all beautiful, but that one in particular. So I also wanted to touch on honeybees. So these are probably the bees that most people are familiar with, but the European honeybee or Apis mellifera isn't actually a native species in the Americas. This bee is also very different from many of our native bees. They're social bees. They have a caste system, meaning they have a queen, workers, drones, and have colonies that are quite long-lived. Honeybees overwinter by feeding on honey stores. And because of this, many of you likely know beekeepers keep honeybees in hives and manage them for crop pollination as well as honey. They're often moved from field to field and sometimes even trucked across the country. And managed hives of the European honeybee pollinate many of our agricultural crops, but there is trouble on relying on just a single pollinator for pollination. It makes the system fragile. Though honeybees are challenged by things like parasites, pathogens, diseases, pesticides, poor nutrition, because they're a managed species, they aren't on the verge of extinction. And because of this, more and more attention has been paid to encouraging conservation of wild bees, on farms and in natural areas, as well as in urban settings. Okay, so now I want to touch on native bees, which is what we're generally talking about when we're talking about conserving pollinators. So most of the more than 3,600 native bee species in the US are quite different from honeybees. About 2/3 of them are ground nesting bees, which means they live below ground. And the only sign of their nests are tiny holes in the ground, like in that middle photo. The other third lives above ground. We generally call these cavity nesting bees, and they live in the holes that you can find in old wood and in pithy plant stems. A good example is the Sara bee, which is a small carpenter bee, and there's a photo of one in a blueberry cane on the right. And about 1% of the native bees are bumblebee species, which form small colonies in hollow cavities, which could be above or below ground. Lots of times they actually use old rodent holes. So it's not always obvious where bees are living. They nest in a variety of different places, in the soil and plant stems and in wood. And they're all over around our homes and gardens. So when we think about how we're managing these spaces, it's really important to consider and be thinking about the needs of bees as well, and to consider how we protect them from pesticides. So when it comes to conservation, what can you do at home? So bees need flowers for food, nesting habitat, and to be protected from pesticides. And at home, we as individuals can actually make a really big difference in our residential landscapes. Residential areas can function as high quality habitat and refuge for insects and even other animals like birds, down to the single site level, like your yard or your neighborhood park. But together, numerous sites like this can kind of scale up and provide connected, functional habitat across the entire landscape. But again, these areas need to be managed properly, and included in that is protecting them from pesticides. Okay, so as this talk is about managing pests while protecting pollinators, let's talk about pests, pesticides, and the risks that pesticides pose to pollinators. So first, I want to touch on what we consider a pest. So one definition is competitors with humans for resources. This could be a moth that defoliates forest trees, or a terrestrial weed that outcompetes food crops, things of that nature. There's also enemies that harm humans, including those that transmit diseases. So examples of these are rats or mosquitoes or ticks that carry disease. And then there's nuisance organisms. So things that we don't like, but they don't actually cause real harm or damage. So, things like this, could be ants in the picnic shelter or dandelions in lawns and grass. So pests, it's really a spectrum. Some of these things need management while others might not. And I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that the vast majority of insect species are actually directly beneficial to humans or otherwise foundational in ecosystems. Less than 2% of described species are what we might consider pests, and even those can be beneficial. Many pest species are the food source for other insects, as some low levels of pests actually support natural enemies like predators and parasitoids, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But we still commonly use pesticides on these organisms, and many of the chemicals we use for insect, disease, and weed management are harmful to more than just their target species. Okay, so now let's talk about pesticides. I'm guessing that most of you, pardon me, are likely aware that many insecticides are highly toxic to pollinators and other insects. Some insecticides are more targeted than others in the groups of insects they impact, but many tend to be very broad. They kill target pests, but also everything else in your yard and around the house. And this is very pertinent to later in the talk when I talk about beneficial insects, because pesticide treatments can also kill those organisms, which can lead to worse pest problems down the road because those organisms that keep pests in check aren't there anymore. So modern insecticides are very potent, and the newer ones, you may have heard of neonicotinoids or neonics, that have been made to replace older chemicals aren't more friendly to bees. And I also want to note really quickly that one of the other downsides of pesticides is that they only treat the symptom of the pest outbreak. It's the pest outbreak itself, not what's causing that outbreak. So it's kind of like taking Advil for a headache, when really what you need is to get new glasses or to stop staring at computer screens as much. So when we think about pesticides, we often think about agricultural areas, but they're really commonly used in urban areas as well. And in fact, more pesticides are actually used per acre in urban areas than many agricultural areas. In our communities, pesticides are often used for cosmetic reasons, to kind of maintain manicured landscapes, and they can wash off grass, patios, and impervious surfaces and end up in our waterways. And in fact, 61% of rivers in agricultural areas and 90% of rivers in urban areas contain pesticides at levels that are risky to aquatic life, which is really something to be concerned about. So in order to protect pollinators from pesticides, it's important to think about all the way that pollinators can be exposed to these chemicals. When you're doing this, it's important to understand the life cycle of the pollinators in your yard in order to protect them from pesticide exposure. As I mentioned a little bit ago, some pollinators nest in the ground, some in plant stems, some of them use leaves for their nests, and then they visit different plants at different times of year as well. So exposure pathways depend on the pollinator's life history, but also on the pesticide and how it's applied. These pathways include direct contact, when a pesticide is applied directly to a pollinator, indirect contact, for example, when pollinators come into contact with a flower that has pesticide residue on it, contaminated nest sites or materials, if the ground a bee is nesting in or the stem that they've hollowed out has pesticide residue is an example of this. And then also systemic contact, if pesticides move through the plants that they're applied to. So a quick definition, for systemic pesticides, instead of being sprayed on the plant like foliar sprays, the plant takes the pesticide up through the soil or at an injection point, like arborists using an injection in a tree. And the pesticide moves throughout the plant's tissue, which means that pesticide residues can be found in flowers and pollen, even if the flower was never actually sprayed with pesticides directly. So the type of bee or other pollinator and its behavior, for example, whether it nests in the soil or above ground, are key to understanding possible exposure routes to pesticides. So language on pesticide labels often tries to reduce exposure to bees. For example, you may see language that cautions applicators to only apply when bees aren't flying or when plants aren't in bloom. So some applicators spray just before bloom, but this can still leave residue on plants. And bumblebees fly earlier in the day than honeybees. So night spraying, which is sometimes advised to avoid contact exposure and to allow some time for the pesticide to get absorbed and broken down, might not work as well to limit exposure to bumblebees and other bees that fly earlier in the day. And of course, there are pollinators that fly at night, such as moths. So the life cycle, behavior, social structure, these are all important things to consider when you're thinking about native bees, or really any species of concern, and how the label directions on pesticides may or may not be protective. So I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but I wanted to touch a little bit on pesticide oversight and why just following the label isn't necessarily a good practice to protect pollinators. So pesticide law uses cost-benefit analysis, and it expects risks to occur because of the perceived benefits of pesticides. So we want to do more than just follow the label on pesticides. Current federal regulation states that pesticides should have no unreasonable adverse effects, but that's really open to interpretation. As I mentioned, federal pesticide regulation both accepts and expects there to be risks to wildlife. So when we're trying to recover pollinator species or create havens for insects in our homes and our yards, that standard isn't enough, which is why we really encourage you to go beyond just following what's on the label to find ways to truly protect these species. So there's a long list of ways that the EPA, the federal agency overseeing pesticides, the assessments underestimate the risk to pollinators, which then leads to harmful pesticide uses. A few of the key concerns are that the assessments focus only on one chemical at a time, but out in the environment, pesticides are rarely found alone. Whether you're looking at water, soil, or pollinator habitat. We had a milkweed sampling study that found up to 25 pesticides on a single plant, with an average of 9 pesticides per plant. And we almost never know how these pesticides are interacting together and what the impact then on pollinators is. They also don't consider specific risks to native bees and butterflies, like contaminated soil for ground nesting bees isn't considered, even though independent research has shown harm, or what this exposure does to the immature stages of insects instead of just the adults. Another problem with standard toxicity testing is that it only looks at one outcome, death. But bees that are exposed to less than a dose that kills them can have other negative responses. And we call these sublethal effects. So a sublethal effect is anything short of death that's observed. So these include things like decreased growth, a behavioral change, a change in physiology, a change in learning ability, things like that. So many of these impacts might reduce a bee's ability to reproduce or to actually provision its offspring with pollen and nectar. So even though the individual bee might not die, these small effects can add up at the population level to kind of decrease populations. With COVID tests being so common these days, lots of people talk about false negatives due to the COVID testing. And similarly, you can kind of think of the EPA's risk assessment process as allowing for false negatives and that we miss actual risk. So a great example of this kind of false negative pitfall are fungicides. So they're generally classified as practically non-toxic to bees, but there's been new research that's finding significant risks from the use of some fungicides. For example, symptoms resembling malnutrition were noted after bee exposure to some fungicides. These included reduced brood rearing, queen loss, increased pathogen levels. And also, we found that some types of fungicides actually interact synergistically with certain insecticides, which increases the toxicity to bees. More research that's been recently done on fungicides is showing other concerns. For example, studies that have found a loss in wild bee abundance, associated with fungicide use. So this is kind of an example of one of those concerns with kind of the pesticide regulation process. Okay, so next let's talk about protecting pollinators and addressing pesticides in yards and gardens. So protecting pollinators from pesticides isn't just about making sure the product you buy doesn't have a warning sign about bees. The first most important step is not considering pesticide products to be your first line of defense if you have an unwanted plant or insect in your yard. Especially in yards and gardens, ultimately, we would like to see elimination of pesticide use, especially for aesthetic or cosmetic concerns. To do this, you should manage your yard to prevent pests, which is something we'll go into a little bit more detail about. And a lot of this is just about keeping your plants healthy. The next step, if you do get pests, before intervening, confirm that the pest is really a problem. Oftentimes it's just a cosmetic issue and can be ignored or managed without any pesticides. Finally, when you determine management is needed, seek out non-chemical management before ever reaching for a pesticide. I know that this can take time to kind of build resilience in your yard and garden and to learn about non-chemical solutions. So we don't expect everyone to go cold turkey, but eventually this is what we'd really encourage you to do. I also do want to add, where cosmetic issues from insect herbivory do arise, I'd really encourage you to shift your perspective to appreciate the diversity of life that your yard can support, and just try to appreciate the overall ecological beauty your yard is providing. An herbivore is not necessarily a pest. Just because something's eating your plant doesn't mean it's bad. Lots of people plant milkweed to conserve monarchs, and you want to see the monarch butterflies eating those milkweeds. As I mentioned, only about 2% of insects are considered pests. The other 98% are actively beneficial to you or the ecosystem. Yeah, again, so while foliage being fed on won't look perfect, this herbivory isn't going to kill hardy plants. Okay, so what can you do practically? As you manage your yard habitat, you should focus on preventing issues rather than treating pests if they arise. So start by choosing the right plants for the local conditions, or as people say, right plant, right place. This means if you have a sunny, dry yard, for example, plant drought-tolerant species. If you have a wet or shady yard, use plants that grow well in those conditions. This might seem simple, but if you put a plant that loves shade into a hot, dry place, it's either going to die or just be really stressed trying to survive, and it won't have the resources to fight off pests or diseases. Next, it's important to water appropriately to provide plants with the correct resources. Not too much, not too little. The best options for garden watering are soaker hoses or drip irrigation, not the overhead sprinklers that go back and forth. Those overhead sprinklers tend to water just the top inch or two of soil, and that promotes shallow root growth. And what you really want to promote is deep root growth so that your plants can withstand heat and drought stress later in the season, and again, then be more resistant to pests. So the next thing to think about to build healthy soils, I should say the next thing to think about with building a good foundation is to build healthy soils with the correct nutrient and pH levels. And you can get inexpensive soil tests through soil labs, often through your local university or extension office. They can tell you if your soil is deficient in anything. And the last thing to ensure is to ensure that your plants are spaced out so that they receive good sunlight and airflow, which will make them less stressed and less susceptible to issues like powdery mildew. And I skipped a bullet point there on accident. Also, for vegetables in particular, looking for resistant varieties is also, a really great bet to try to, have a yard and garden that is resistant to some of these pest issues. So though I think these are all good gardening tips in general, this all relates to pest outbreaks because stressed plants have a more difficult time mustering defenses against infection or infestation. So another thing to think about is plant diversity. Including a variety of flowering plants can really reduce the threat of pest infestations that could impact your entire garden. As I mentioned, most insects are beneficial in some way, and a diversity of plant species provides complex habitat structure and resources for natural enemy populations. And natural enemies are arthropods that either eat or parasitize pest insects that provide pest control. So diverse plantings have been shown to boost natural enemy diversity, and in turn, these will help suppress pests in your yard. And I'll talk more about this in a little bit. Okay, so monitoring and documenting. Problems can arise even in a really well-planned garden. Uh, and how can you nip these issues in the bud? Um, the first step is just to slow down and observe your garden. What insects are there, and see if there are signs of plant damage, yeah, or other symptoms like that. Sometimes the obvious issue is the plant damage itself, and you don't see insects on the plant. Look closely, around your plants. Do you see evidence of insects having been there, like insect frass, fine webbing, or mining trails in the leaves, for example? Uh, you can look at symptoms you see on leaves and flowers, like holes being cut all the way through, skeletonizing of tissue between leaf veins, or dieback of stems or branches. You might see spotted browning, which might be indicative of leafhoppers or scale insects, or curling leaves, which might be a sign of aphids. And I want to note that smartphones can be a super useful gardening tool. Good photos can help experts identify the specific issue. And then you can also use your smartphone to keep notes on when the problem developed, what types of symptoms you observe, how many insects are present, or the extent of the damage. All of these observations will really help in identifying and then choosing how to manage the issue later. So to manage pests and diseases, you need to know the life cycles and the habitat needs of those pests. So it's really important to know exactly what you're dealing with before you make any decisions about management. And again, remember, just because something is eating your plants doesn't mean it's harmful. It might be beneficial in some way. As I mentioned before, you need caterpillars to have butterflies and moths, and those caterpillars need to feed on leaves. But of course, at other times, you don't want them destroying plants. This photo is from my colleague, Emily May, who found these caterpillars munching on purple coneflowers in her garden. And she wanted to save these flowers because they provide food for pollinators, and the caterpillars were really kind of going to town on the entire stand of flowers. So the next step is actually identifying the pest. Not everyone probably knows an entomologist, but there's still a lot of resources to help identify insects and plant diseases. A quick internet search with a description of the insect and the damage that you see on the affected plant can be a really good start. But I do want to caution about over-interpreting based on those initial search results. For a better, more personalized kind of advice and information, you can contact your local university cooperative extension office or plant diagnostic laboratory, which can offer expert advice that's tailored to your local area, because there's just so much variability between locations and pests and even site-specific differences. We also frequently recommend master gardener hotlines. And I want to note that you should be cautious about identifications and also advice that you receive from pest control or land care companies, because they have an incentive to sell products or services associated with that advice. There are also other options online that might help you figure out what insects are in your yard. Bugguide.net is a really great online resource for insect identification. There's a community of experts that provide photo identification of insects, and I've actually used this one a lot in my work in the past. And actually posting a photo on social media platforms can also really result in helpful information as well. So, I can't give you all the answers today, as I was mentioning. I don't have them all because things are, so plant and location specific. But the goal is to kind of get you familiar with the tools that you can use to kind of take these steps on your own. So the next question is when and how to intervene. Sometimes intervening with non-chemical methods is needed when something seems out of balance, if the damage is a threat to the survival of the plant. In this photo, flowers were being eaten by butterflies and eliminating that pollen and nectar resource that attracts bees and other beneficial insects. Um, so what should so I think the best way to think about intervention is look at what you should do to interrupt an insect's life cycle to reduce the damage to plants. And one really key way is to remove its food and shelter. I showed those flowers in Emily's yard, the slide before. In that case, she plucked flower heads that showed frass from caterpillars, leaving only the flower heads with no signs of infestation. And then she bagged the cut flower heads and threw them away. Don't compost these things because then the pest will just get out. As home gardeners, we can tolerate more damage to plants and gardens than farmers do, for example. And just because a pest is present doesn't mean it's a problem. It may be present at a level that can be kept in check by beneficial insects and doesn't threaten the health of your plants. And again, a reminder that just because an insect is an herbivore does not mean it's a pest. So with the intervention in this example, the presence of the caterpillars itself, wasn't a threshold for action. In fact, it's great that caterpillars, are using garden plants as resources, again, because they're food for birds. But in some years, maybe the caterpillar infestations, are kept in check by predators, and the outbreak is an imbalance in the system. So the long-term response is to keep increasing diversity in your yard to promote beneficial insects that can feed on those caterpillars. So if you do have pest outbreaks, there are many non-chemical methods to deal with pests. For many diseases and certain larval infestations, sanitation, so the removal of infested plant material, is a really good choice for reducing the level of damage and breaking that development cycle I mentioned of the pest or the disease. Infested flowers can be cut and thrown away, again, not composted. For other insect outbreaks, hand picking and squishing pests, or just knocking them off with water can be a really good first step. Hand picking can be a bit tedious. I've done this a lot with larger caterpillars in the garden, but it is deliberate, it is cautious, and it saves other wildlife in your yard from harm. For weeds, you can consider using barriers and mulches to suppress them, and then of course hand pulling them before they go to seed to reduce seed set in subsequent years. Again, ultimately, pest control is often about figuring out what attracted the pest to your yard and what can be changed so that they can't thrive. It is really cool how a quick online search these days often gives a good overview of any pests and ways to manage it without chemicals. Okay, so I want to touch on conservation biological control. So another type of pest control is biocontrol, which refers to pest control by the natural enemies that are already present in your yard. So in the context of home gardens, this is something that you would integrate by planting a diversity of plants. So it's not something to necessarily respond to a pest outbreak, but it's a really great and important method of pest control. So you increase populations by improving habitat in your yard, which has the added benefit of also providing habitat for pollinators and a whole host of other great insects. So before I talk to you a little bit about improving habitat in your yard, I want to show you some examples of natural enemies so that if you aren't familiar with them, you can keep an eye out for them in your yard. So there really are countless species of natural enemies in different groups, but I wanted to show you a few common groups that your garden could support and likely already does support. And then you can find out more information on our website or through many extension agencies that have published guides to natural enemies. Okay, so first we have predators. So these are organisms that kill and eat their prey. Predators tend to be generalists, meaning they eat a wide variety of other insect species. And on this slide, we have ambush and assassin bugs, which are great examples. You can kind of gather that by their name. And both the immature stages, the nymphs and the adults are predatory, and they eat a variety of prey, including caterpillars, beetles, leafhoppers. Another common predator are big-eyed bugs and minute pirate bugs. These are really small. They're only 2 to 5 millimeters long, but both the adults and the nymphs are predators, which is great. In general, they're really great predators of soft-bodied insects, caterpillars, aphids, but larger predatory true bugs often have a more diverse prey preference. And these also overwinter in leaf litter and under bark. Okay, moving to a different insect order, we have lacewings, the larvae of which are really voracious predators and consume over 400 aphids in a week. They also eat things like aphids. Oh, sorry, I said aphids. They also eat things like caterpillars, insect eggs, mites, other small insects. Uh, and the adults of some species are also predaceous, and then other species eat nectar and pollen. They overwinter also in leaf litter, soil, under bark, places like that. You might see syrphid flies or hoverflies in your garden, and their larvae are actually really great pet predators. A single larva can actually eat hundreds of aphids in a week. The adults, meanwhile, they feed on pollen and nectar, and they're good pollinators. So you kind of get a double bonus with syrphid flies, and then they overwinter in leaf litter or in soil. And you can see there's an adult on the left and a larva in the larger right side. The next example is one most people are probably familiar with, lady beetles. So lady beetles are fantastic natural enemies because they're predatory during their entire life, all their life stages during their entire life. And individuals might consume as many as 5,000 aphids in their lifetime. They also eat things like mites, whiteflies, scale insects, other soft-bodied insects, and also insect eggs. Adult lady beetles will also eat pollen and nectar, and often overwinter in protected places like under vegetation, again, under bark, in leaf litter, kind of sheltered places like that. So another beetle are ground beetles. So the larvae and adults are both important predators of soil pests. They can remove up to 4,000 cutworms per acre per day, and actually kill more prey than they can consume. And some species will also eat weed seeds, which is great as well. Yeah, there's estimates that they consume their body weight in prey daily, and again can actually kill more prey than they eat. And a lot of these beetles kind of take shelter and overwinter in bunch grasses. So in that photo there, you see what's called a beetle bank, where people are, the farmers will plant these rows of grasses to provide habitat for these beetles to provide pest control in crops. So there's also predatory wasps. So I know wasps are often looked at, kind of with an evil eye, but they actually are really great predators, and eat all sorts of insects. And the adults will feed on flower nectar. Many of them nest underground or in tunnel cavities, and many are solitary species, but social paper wasps also are beneficial insects. And here's a photo of some solitary wasps. I really like the sand wasps. They're really fun to watch kind of dig. Okay, so now I want to touch on parasitoids. Oops. Along with predators, the other major group of natural enemies are parasitoids. So unlike predators, these insects don't kill their hosts right away. Rather, they lay their eggs in or on their host, generally either the eggs or the larva, where they then feed and eventually kill the host. Many of these parasitoids are very host specific, which can be really useful, while others are more generalists. So in particular, I want to touch on parasitoid wasps, which may be one of the most diverse groups of insects. It's actually suspected that every insect species has at least one parasitoid that feeds on it. And they can be very tiny, and some of them, only parasitize the eggs of a particular insect species, while others might be more general in their selection of prey, but often target a certain life stage, like the egg or larva. Sometimes they're so small that they're actually really hard to see, but you can see their activity, like the aphid mummies, you might see on leaves, emergence holes in eggs, or pupa on caterpillars. And the adults will feed on nectar. They'll use flowers, extrafloral nectaries, or even they'll feed on honeydew, which is a sugary liquid that's secreted by Homopteran insects as a food source. I also want to mention that there's more than insects as natural enemies. I don't have time to touch on everything, but spiders are great predators, both the immature and adult stages. They're generalists and can live in a variety of different parts of your garden. You might see crab spiders up in the flowers. There's also spiders that live more on the ground in the soil. And as far as other non-insect natural enemies, there's predatory mites. You can even think about things like birds as natural enemies because they eat insects, and many of them will eat insects that are pest insects. Okay, so when we're thinking about providing habitat to beneficial insects, what do we need to consider? The first is floral resources, flowers. So as you probably realized as I was reading through some of those natural enemy examples, many beneficial insects rely on pollen or nectar at specific periods of their life cycle. Or they can use these resources to supplement their diets when insect prey isn't available. So the next question then is, what types of plants do you want to pick? Many of the same plants that support pollinators will also support beneficial insects, which is really great. So a big key is to have a diversity of plant types with long flowering durations and different textures, because these are what really create complex habitat. So you should prioritize native plants, include diversity for season-long bloom, and again, select plants that are suitable for your site, the soil, sun, moisture levels. I also do want to stress that habitat can be multifunctional. You can let vegetables and herbs go to flower to provide those flowering resources. You can install insectary strips or beetle banks in your vegetable gardens. Bunch grasses can be really ornamental and look nice. And though they don't provide the flowering resources we commonly think about for pollinators, they provide habitat refuge for things like those ground beetles, that need that type of plant for shelter. So on the topic of plant selection, I do want to note that another hidden risk of pesticide exposure in home gardens are plants purchased from nurseries. The demand for nursery plants to be aesthetically appealing, pest-free, and damage-free is really high. So that, combined with interstate rules to reduce pest spread, leads to significant pesticide use in nursery production. And a number of studies have found neonics and other pesticides contaminating plants. So trying to source pesticide-free plants can be a really difficult thing to do, as a lot of nurseries don't even know how plants were treated before they got them. But some steps to take when buying are to ask for organic plants, avoid plants treated with long-lived systemic insecticides, and try to get to know nursery practices to be sure they're using pollinator or beneficial insect-friendly production. And we actually have a publication about that you can find on our website. I also want to note quickly that in general, for providing habitat, it's best to not use cultivated plants. Avoid double-flowered. Sorry, my slides are jumping here. To not use double-flowered hybrids or other ornate modern varieties or cultivars, because a lot of these produce little or no nectar. Garden varieties are often bred for characteristics that we as humans find desirable, but those aren't necessarily things that insects find desirable. So all plants aren't created equal for this kind of application. Just because it blooms doesn't mean it gives pollen and nectar. Just because it gives pollen and nectar doesn't mean bees or other insects will like or visit it. Okay, there we go. So another thing that beneficial insects need is shelter. So adequate shelter provides protection for egg laying and overwintering sites, which can include things like old stems, leaf litter, tussocks, brush piles, rock piles, stumps, things like that. You probably noticed as I was reading through those examples of natural enemies that many of them overwinter in places like leaf litter and under bark. So try to protect any area in your yard that provides shelter already, rather than necessarily trying to take steps to create nesting areas. Less is more lots of times for managing shelter areas for insects. One of the things we recommend people to do is to leave the leaves in the fall, since so many insect species use those leaves for overwintering. And then also you can leave things like dried stems up until the spring, and then you can cut and remove them and put them into the side in case any insects emerge. An example is that photo in the top right, where you see like the new growth with those old stems. So I just wanted to touch on the note of complexity. Lawns, there's over 40 million acres of lawns in the US, and lawns support far fewer pollinators, beneficial insects, songbirds, than flowering native plants do. As I've been mentioning, landscape complexity really enhances natural beneficial insect populations. So the message is diverse plantings are great for beneficial insects and for pollinators, while lawns are really not good habitat for these species. So finally, I really want to encourage you all to again think of your yard as habitat and to accept some level of cosmetic damage in your home gardens. Because ultimately this means your yard is being used as habitat by a broad community of insects, birds, and other animals. And I hope you can embrace the idea of your yard having ecological beauty, as well as kind of the traditional garden aesthetic. Again, as I've mentioned, caterpillars feeding on leaves means you're providing resources to butterflies, and in turn, those are providing resources for birds. So the choices that we make in green spaces and residential landscapes really have wide-reaching impacts on biodiversity, and eliminating pesticide use is a way to make a really big difference. So I want to end by re-emphasizing that you can make that difference at home. Habitat loss and fragmentation is a leading cause of species extinctions. But the great news is that insects are able to use small patches and little partial habitats like yards. And improvements to these habitats that we have at home can have dramatic results, especially for generalist species. So I want to thank you for attending this webinar, being curious and caring about protecting pollinators and other invertebrates. And I hope that you can implement some of what you've learned today at home. So now I think we have time for a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Yeah, just to repeat, if you have any questions, please put that in the Q&A icon or in the question and answer box using the Q&A icon. So we have a few kind of questions all over the place. So I'm just going to start at the beginning here. Can you clarify for Barbara if mosquito dunks containing BT will kill dragonfly larvae?
That's a great question. So I believe that the BT dunks are specific to mosquitoes and other kind of similarly related flies. But we encourage people to try to avoid using BT dunks. So mosquito management, I wanted to actually include some stuff about mosquito management in this talk, but didn't have time. So I was hoping we'd be able to talk about it a little bit in the Q&As. So the most important thing with mosquito management is to just change out water, every, hopefully like 4 to 5 days, because mosquitoes can do their life cycle in about 8 to 10 days. And they only need about an inch of water. But the great news is that if you're thinking about like a watering can, a bird bath, or pet bowls, all you need to do is just make sure that water is changed out. Again, like every 5 days or so, and you won't risk having mosquitoes develop in those water sources. For mosquito management, we also encourage just checking to make sure there's no areas of standing water around your yard. So look for things like water in gutters that have been kind of clogged up by leaves. It's easy to leave like a bucket or gardening equipment like behind a shed that can fill up with water over the winter. So make sure things like that are drained. And then if you have a pond, I'm not sure where Barbara is referencing, mosquitoes can only actually reproduce in still water. So if you have a pond and you can include just a small pump or a little water feature, that water circulation will prevent mosquitoes from being able to reproduce in your pond. And if you have questions about mosquito management in larger kind of wetland areas, we have resources on that at our website. We also have resources for home mosquito management on the website as well. So we'd encourage people to use other methods before for mosquito dunks, because there's a lot of really easy ways to control mosquito populations in your home yards. I think also communicating with your neighbors as well, because mosquitoes are really good at flying. So you might have your yard all set up. You don't have any standing water. You're changing out bird baths or pet bowls. But if your neighbor has a bunch of standing water, you're still going to get those mosquitoes. So they're not very strong at flying. So one thing you can do is have a light fan blowing on you in the evenings when you're sitting on the porch or the patio. You can also, of course, wear long sleeve clothing to try to prevent mosquito issues as well.
Thank you. Yeah, a few people had questions about mosquitoes, so answered all of those in one fell swoop. So another question from Brenda. They are interested in using more biological control methods and want to increase the level of lady beetles in their yard. How effective is buying egg sacs in spring and trying to establish a larger population, or does that cause more havoc as they potentially shift some of the unknown balance of insects that already exist?
That's a really great question, and thank you for asking that one. So, you might have noticed in this talk, I emphasized building habitat to try to increase the populations of natural enemies that are already in your site and in your garden, trying to draw them in from surrounding areas. There's a lot of potential issues with releasing, store-bought lady beetles. One of them is that there's not necessarily anything to keep them there on the site. So if you release lady beetles, they might just move off site to your neighbor's yard or to a natural area where they might be able to find more, suitable food. The other thing is that there's some issues with the collection of these lady beetles. Lots of times what they actually do, I think a common one that's used is the convergent lady beetle. And it is native to the US, but it aggregates in big aggregation, I guess, piles of beetles when they kind of gather in places like valleys in the Sierras. And people will actually go out and essentially just shovel piles of these beetles, into sacks to then distribute throughout the country. So there's questions with, how does that impact the population of these lady beetles in the areas that they're being collected in, and then also, I think as the question kind of asked, it's not always known then what the impact of those lady beetles when they're released in all the way across the country will have on the species that are already present there. So because of that, we'd encourage you to just try to increase the beneficial insect habitat that you have, because you'll find these insects everywhere, and it's one of those things, not to sound kind of corny, but if you build it, that they will come. And then one other consideration too, sorry, that just kind of came to mind, is also with transporting insects across the country. There can be issues with pathogens. Maybe the collected beetles had some sort of pathogen or parasite that then is getting transported across the country to somewhere else, which is something that we would want to avoid as well.
Great, we get that question a lot, so I appreciate you answering it. This person is asking if there could be a non-chemical alternative for fungicides.
That's a great question. I think that a lot of that depends. This is kind of where I'm qualifying and saying that I don't have all the answers. I think it depends on the plant. It depends on the kind of fungus or mildew that you're trying to control. So I would encourage looking at some of those resources I recommended. We have some on our website, and if you have any specific questions about a specific, if you're concerned about a specific product, you can always email us. But I encourage, looking at some of those things like extension service, as well as master gardener hotlines, and see if you can get kind of more specific information for your region, for your plant, for if you can get a diagnosis on what's actually on your plant, that kind of can help narrow down what your options are.
Okay, and kind of in that same kind of alternative use, Stella is asking if you can please address vinegar use.
Oh, That's a good question. I don't have a great answer for that because I know people use vinegar for different things. Yeah, so I think that, again, that would be a question that I would probably, depending on how you're using it, I would kind of gear that towards, extension service or your master gardener hotline to kind of get an opinion. I think what I would caution is that there are a lot of home remedies that you can read about where people will mix things like foot fungus cream and like vinegar together to go put on the plant. And just because something isn't toxic to us doesn't mean it's not going to be toxic to both your plant and also insects. So it's definitely one of those things that you want to be cautious. Just because it's something that's familiar to you doesn't mean it's not going to impact an insect if it's on it directly or actually your plant itself.
That's a really good point. Jackie is wondering how long neonics persist systematically in plants.
That's a great question.
Systemically, sorry.
What was that? Sorry.
Oh, systemically, sorry.
Yeah. So there's been studies that neonics can last systemically in some plant tissue for over a year, for months. So that's really a reason that these insecticides are so concerning, is because they're frequently used to treat all sorts of crop pests, ornamental pests, but also in things like trees. An arborist might see a tree is diseased or might be at risk of an insect infestation and use trunk injections of systemic insecticides like neonics. And yeah, there's been research that has shown that these can still be expressed in the leaves the next year. So that's a reason to be really concerned about those pesticides.
As a follow-up to that, can plants treated with neonics transfer those pesticides into the seeds that they produce?
That's a really good question. And I should know the answer to that, but you can look that up. And if you want to send an email to our pesticides at Xerces.org hotline, I can get back to you on to that.
Okay, perfect. So this is a great question. Sorry, you're just scrolling up. We're getting a lot of really good questions. Deb is wondering how they can balance cleaning the debris in their garden to keep bad insects from overwintering, but also leaving it for good insects. Do you have any insight into that balance?
Oh, what was the question? To keep bad insects from overwintering?
Yes.
Oh, that's a great question. So what I would say is that it's most important to just provide that habitat for the beneficial insects. I think that it's kind of like what I was mentioning with insecticide use. If you use insecticides and you knock down all of the natural enemies as well as the pests, when the pests come back, they're going to explode even more because there's no natural enemies to kind of keep those populations in check. So similarly, I think the benefit from leaving that complex habitat, those overwintering resources for the beneficial insects, is more important than worrying about any pest insects that might be also overwintering. I think too that what I was kind of mentioning as well is, if you do see that you're having pest issues in the yard and garden, try to remove those infested materials and throw them away so that they go off site. But if you're not seeing a real pest outbreak in your yard, and things seem to be in balance, for lack of a better term, I don't think you need to worry about leaving the leaves, leaving complex nesting habitat as something that's also going to really make pest populations explode. In general, pests do really well when there's a simple landscape comparatively, because they can really, pests of that specific thing can really go to town on it. While when you have really complex habitat with different plants, different resources, that tends to just have, you can support this wider array of natural enemies and other insect species. And I think something to keep in mind, sorry, this is a very long answer, is that a low level of pests is needed to support those natural enemy populations. If you had absolutely nothing that they could feed on, then you wouldn't be able to support those populations. So it all just is kind of like a balance. Having a low level of what we might consider pest insects, again, or just herbivores in general, is not a problem in and of itself, and it's going to be able to help support those other insects and arthropods that you want, that are going to kind of keep those pests in check.
That was great. It's not always a simple answer. It's always a little bit more complex than we think, but diversity is key with a little bit of tolerance, it sounds like. So we have a couple beetle questions. Carol is wondering what you would recommend for controlling specifically Japanese beetles.
Oh, yeah. So that's another, again, I hesitate to kind of prescribe, specific solutions, just because things can be so context dependent. And here why I am in Oregon, I think the Japanese beetles are just kind of coming in, but I don't have any personal experience with it. But I would, that definitely be something that I think would be great to reach out to, again, not to keep repeating myself, Master Gardener hotlines, as well as, your local extension service, to see if they have suggestions that are kind of specific to your region, and the type of plants that you have and are seeing the beetles on. I think, something that I do want to caution too is, I think, a lot of extension services are great and provide great information, but, there may be, obviously advice that is pesticide related. So again, trying to look for those alternative measures.
Okay, great. Laura is asking about any biocontrol agents available for ticks or pollinator-friendly tick management recommendations.
Yeah, so I don't know of any biocontrol agents for ticks in general. One of the things that is recommended, for tick control is, having, I think that, again, I know I'm just repeating myself, that diversity of habitat, so that you have some of the predators, and I believe birds will eat ticks. But then something you can do is kind of have a several meter wide kind of like section of like bark chips between, if you have natural area and then, your yard, to kind of make it so, you don't have the natural area or grassland where you might have a lot of ticks in that grass kind of meeting your yard. Creating that little barrier is something that can be effective to kind of keep ticks from coming in from a high area of higher population to your yard.
Okay, great. We have a couple people asking about how to manage adult grasshoppers.
That's, again, sorry about the like, kind of qualifying all of the questions about, individual species. But again, I would ask, again, for advice from, a resource that's kind of located more centrally, for your area, because, grasshoppers can vary from, like little things, to, some people, consider like the super large, like kind of locusty grasshoppers, in rangeland, as things that can obviously cause problems. So again, that answer is going to kind of depend on what type of grasshopper you have, what type of yard you have. So again, I'd look at some of those other resources. And again, having a diverse habitat that provides habitat for things like, birds, that will eat some of those grasshoppers, is really important as well.
Karen just chimed in and said that people can catch them and eat them, those grasshoppers.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, great solution. Get your kids, give them like a penny per grasshopper or something.
There you go.
Cook them up for dinner. Oh, I love that.
Twice the protein as beef, so.
Yeah, more sustainable as well. So we have a question, and we get this often in other webinars as well, as neem oil. Is that considered safe for treatments?
Yeah, so it depends on the like context, I think, of how some of these products are being applied. Neem oil, I think if it's directly applied to something where pollinators flying, can cause issues. So I think it can be a little context dependent. So, it would still be something I think that we would recommend trying to use some of these other methods first, some of like the non-chemical methods, but certainly some of the organic insecticides can be less toxic than some of the synthetic ones, but a lot of organic ones are still very toxic. And because of that, you want to kind of be careful about how and when you're applying them.
Okay. So we have a few different questions and a couple more minutes left here. So I'm going to jump to Matthew's question about soil contamination by neonics. Can newly growing plants pick neonics up from the soil?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Newly growing plants can pick up neonics from the soil. So soil that's been treated, previously with neonics is a concern. So that's also a reason that they are of such concern. So I think it's something to consider when also we're talking about purchasing plants from nurseries that may have been using some of these. It's another reason to try to kind of be sure you're buying what we're calling be safe plants, because they can be picked up from the soil. And it's not just neonics. There's other kind of systemic insecticides, some that are used for soil, kind of drenches and trench treatments for like house kind of pests like carpenter ants or even just nuisance ants, like the little sugar ants. They're in a study that we did looking at milkweed pesticide residues, there was one house that we sampled milkweed at that there had been no insecticide application since the homeowner had purchased it, which was 6 years before. But milkweed that she had planted in that soil still expressed neonics, presumably because there had been some sort of treatment in that soil at least 6 years before, and it was still being able to be picked up and expressed in the milkweed. So yeah, that's something to really be aware of and consider.
Wow, that's kind of crazy. All right, so Jane has a really good question and something we get asked a lot. It's specific to mosquito management, but she's asking, what if your neighbor insists on using mosquito authority and having them come over every 3 weeks? They live on the coast where the winds are often 10 miles per hour. So how do you deal with that when your neighbors are not doing kind of what you would recommend they do in their own yard?
That's a really great question, and one that I wish there was an answer where you could kind of snap your finger and solve it. But I think the first thing is, it obviously depends on the relationship you have with your neighbor. I think that, if you have a good relationship with them, addressing it in a friendly way, not a way that you are saying, hey, you're doing this wrong, but kind of try to broach the conversation of why you are concerned and why you manage your yard and garden the way you do, and try to kind of get an understanding of what their concerns are and why they're managing their yard in the way they are, and see if you can find some sort of common ground. It could be that the neighbor doesn't know that there's these really easy non-toxic ways to control for mosquitoes. With those mosquito sprays, they only target adult mosquitoes, and again, since mosquitoes can fly from other distances, it's really easy then for other mosquitoes just to fly right back in. So I think trying to have that conversation in a non-confrontational way, and just provide some of those resources. We have resources if they're interested. If they really don't want to, have that conversation, if it's not something they're at all open to, what you can do is, to kind of prevent drift. You could plant some larger, plants to essentially form a barrier to kind of keep drift from coming into your yard. So you could kind of plant those along the edges. If you do choose that, you should choose plants like kind of just, coniferous shrubs or something like that that don't flower, so that you're then not attracting pollinators and other beneficial insects onto those kind of drift barriers that, then might get contacted by, the chemicals being used by the mosquito spraying company. So yeah, those would kind of be my suggestions on that.
Okay, great. So we have time for just about one more question. I've gotten a few questions specific to bees or wasps, kind of seeing them as pests and just generally overall how worried people should be about them.
Yeah.
Courtney's asking about carpenter bees specifically and how much of a threat they are to structures. They've been told that woodpeckers can come after them and cause even more damage. And our bee hotel is kind of maybe a good way to get them away from their buildings. And then we also have a question about wasps and sheds and barns and how to keep them out of those areas in a non-toxic way.
Yeah, so those are good questions. So my understanding is that carpenter bees, at not like super high levels, aren't really that much of a threat to structures. And the issue with the bee hotels is that a lot of carpenter bees aren't going to use those because carpenter bees, are generally too large, and a lot of those holes are kind of like pre-existing. They're not what a carpenter bee would use. There's a chance that putting out other wood, might be able to, serve as a place where carpenter bees can go. I know one thing people do if they are having an issue with carpenter bees is you can kind of cover that area where they're making their nests with some sort of kind of like thin metal mesh. This is something definitely look up on. I think there's different techniques and different recommendations, but essentially creating this barrier so they can't go through. But then for wasps, a lot of the wasps that cause issues for humans are yellow jackets. A lot of the ones that you actually see under like the eaves and things like that, like paper wasps, tend not to be super aggressive. I can totally understand why people don't want them, right next to their door. But for yellow jackets tend to be the things that are really aggressive and will sting you. And for those, our top recommendation is prevention and kind of sanitation. So they're attracted, to your food, to trash. So making sure that you clean up all of the food on your back patio, so you don't draw in yellow jackets. Making sure that your trash cans are covered in tight fitting so that they can't go into the trash and get food there. That will keep them from essentially just wanting to be on your yard at all. If you do have a nest nearby, where the yellow jackets tend to nest in the ground actually, and they'll use like old rodent holes and things like that. So going out in the spring or winter before the nest establishes and collapsing old rodent holes around your yard is a way to kind of prevent them from nesting there into the summer. And if you do have somebody come out, I'd encourage to control a nest because it's like right next to your patio and causing lots of issues. I'd really encourage them, to ask the pesticide applicator, or I should say the pest control company, why they're doing what they're doing, if they're doing things in an ecologically friendly way as possible, what options there are, and if they do use any type of chemical, making sure that it's very targeted and not they're not creating like a barrier of pesticide sprays around your property or something like that. But in general, a great way to start is prevention, sanitation, and then if you do have those rodent holes in the winter or spring, collapsing them. Obviously, don't do that in the summer when the nest is like actually full of yellow jackets. But those are some of the recommendations we have for dealing with some of those nuisance wasp species.